May 12, 1943, Tunisia. Under the blinding sun of North Africa, the guns finally fell silent. The once proud soldiers of the German Afrika Korps, battle-hardened men who had fought across endless sands, lowered their weapons in the dust of Tunisia. Around 250,000 Axis troops were captured that week. Among them were veterans who had followed Rommel from Tobruk to El Alamein, men who had believed in his legend, and in the myth of an invincible Germany. They were tired, hungry, and defeated. For months, supply convoys from Europe had been cut off by Allied naval power. Their tanks ran on fumes. Their rifles jammed with sand. When the surrender order came, some refused to believe it, others felt only relief. Many expected to be executed or sent to grim prison camps in the desert. What none of them imagined was that their journey would carry them thousands of miles away, to a world they scarcely believed existed. May 18, 1943, Bizerta Harbor. In the heat of Tunisian ports like Bizerta and Oran, the captured men were processed under watchful American and British guards. Their names were logged, their wounds treated, and their ranks recorded. Even here, in the first moments of captivity, the efficiency of their captors was impossible to ignore. Medical officers moved briskly from tent to tent, treating prisoners with antiseptics and sulfa powder, labeling injuries, and assigning rations. Many of the Germans expected to be starved or mistreated. Instead, they were handed tin plates piled with beans, bread, and meat. A lieutenant from the 10th Panzer Division would later write in his journal, "We were prisoners, but fed like guests. I did not know what to think." May 27, 1943, Atlantic Convoy, Operation Torch Route. Within days, groups of prisoners were herded toward the coast, where gray-painted ships waited at anchor. Most of them were Liberty ships, vast steel freighters that the United States had begun producing faster than any nation had ever built ships before. Some had been welded together in less than a week. Their hulls still smelled of oil and new paint. For the Germans who boarded them, these vessels were their first taste of America's industrial might. They were marched up gangways under the glaring sun, hands bound loosely, guards watching from above. As they looked around, they noticed that the ships were spotless. The deck plates were freshly painted, the ropes coiled perfectly, the crew disciplined but relaxed. Many of the German officers whispered to one another, stunned by what they saw. The Americans, they realized, were not improvising this war. They were building it. For nearly 2 weeks, convoys of ships crossed the Atlantic, each carrying hundreds of German prisoners deep into enemy territory. The journey was long and monotonous, punctuated by the occasional alarm when submarine sightings were reported. But even in those moments, the prisoners noticed something else, the calm confidence of their guards. American sailors joked as they worked, played music over loudspeakers, and handed out coffee to the prisoners. On one voyage, a U-boat warning caused the crew to sound battle stations. German prisoners, former U-boat hunters themselves, braced for panic. Instead, they watched as the American gun crews swung their anti-aircraft mounts into position in seconds, cool and practiced. A corporal later admitted to a fellow prisoner, "They train like machines. We were told they were lazy." Each day, they were given 3 full meals. Meat, bread, vegetables, even fruit. For many, it was the first time they'd eaten fresh produce in months. They were stunned again when they saw sailors throw uneaten food into the sea. Bread crusts, half-finished apples, full tins of beans, casually discarded. The Germans stared, unable to comprehend such waste. They had been told that America was decadent, weak, built on comfort. But as they watched these sailors, confident, well-fed, surrounded by machinery that worked flawlessly, they began to understand something far more unsettling. America's power wasn't just in its machines. It was in its abundance. June 9, 1943, Norfolk, Virginia. After nearly 2 weeks at sea, the first ships approached the eastern coast of the United States. The shoreline appeared at dawn, a thin gray line that grew into cranes, docks, and smokestacks. It was Virginia. Norfolk, or Newport News, depending on the convoy. As the ships eased into the harbor, the German prisoners pressed against the rails. What they saw made them silent. Miles of cranes towered over the water, lifting cargo containers as if they were toys. Trains moved endlessly along the docks. Huge warehouses stood shoulder to shoulder, their doors yawning open to reveal stacks of supplies. The sound was constant, steel clanging, horns blaring, engines droning, the low hum of motion. One prisoner, a Luftwaffe mechanic, whispered to his comrade, "They are not fighting the war. They are manufacturing it." June 14, 1943, Midwest Rail Transit. When they disembarked, the docks were filled with hundreds of American soldiers and dockworkers. The organization was flawless, no shouting, no confusion. Each group of prisoners was tagged, counted, and moved onto waiting trains. Some of those trains were old freight cars, but many were Pullman coaches, clean and cooled with fans. Even the guards apologized when the air conditioning failed. For men who had spent weeks in the heat of North Africa, it was astonishing. Some looked through the windows and saw American civilians walking freely, women in summer dresses, children waving at the passing trains. The prisoners stared back, confused. They had expected hatred. Instead, they saw curiosity. As the trains rolled inland, the Germans began to see a country unlike any they had imagined. The propaganda films they had seen back home had shown America as chaotic, poor, and culturally corrupt, a land of jazz, gangsters, and political decay. What passed outside their windows was the opposite. They saw neat farms, endless fields, paved highways cutting straight through the countryside. Every small town they passed glowed with light, even at night. Factory chimneys smoked in the distance. Water towers rose above town centers painted in bright colors. They could not believe the number of cars. Rows upon rows of them parked outside factories and train stations. Even late at night, headlights flickered on the roads. In Germany, civilian cars were rare, gasoline was rationed and factories bombed. But here, the trains passed endless roads filled with trucks, buses, and automobiles. At one stop, the prisoners saw something that left them speechless. Through a wide industrial field in Michigan, they glimpsed the Ford Willow Run plant, a vast sea of steel and glass stretching across the horizon. Inside that building, more than 40,000 workers assembled B-24 Liberator bombers on a moving production line, one rolling out every hour. A prisoner named Hans Lutke, once a toolmaker from Cologne, later told a camp interviewer, "We thought Germany was the land of engineers. Then I saw America." The trains pressed westward. The landscapes changed, the forests of the east gave way to the open plains of the Midwest, then to the hot wind of the south. Everywhere, the same rhythm of motion, trucks hauling cargo, workers tending machines, factories humming day and night. In Kansas, a prisoner scribbled in his diary, "There are more machines here than men." At night, the prisoners watched from their train windows as towns rolled by, each glowing with electric light. In Germany, blackouts had become a way of life. Entire cities went dark to avoid Allied bombers. But here, in the heart of America, the light never seemed to die. Some of the men murmured to each other, uneasy. They were beginning to realize the full scale of what they were up against. Germany had fought with courage, skill, and determination, but it was fighting a nation that could outproduce the world. By the time the trains reached their destinations, military bases and hastily built camps across Texas, Oklahoma, and the Midwest, the psychological shift was already underway. The prisoners stepped down from the cars and found themselves in places they had never heard of: Camp Hearn, Camp Swift, Camp McCain, Camp Algona. Each camp had rows of wooden barracks, neatly aligned, surrounded by barbed wire. But what struck them first was not the confinement, it was the orderliness. The barracks were new. The floors swept clean. The kitchens smelled of bread and coffee. Even the latrines had running water and electric light. For men who had lived in trenches and tents for years, it felt unreal. A German captain was overheard saying quietly to another, "If this is captivity, then what is freedom?" What awaited them beyond those fences would astonish them even more. But for now, as night fell over the endless plains, the prisoners lay awake in their bunks, listening to the low hum of American generators outside the wire. For the first time since the war began, they were not hungry, nor cold, nor afraid of the sky. And yet, something else kept them restless, something they could not yet name. Because deep down, they had begun to sense a truth their propaganda had never told them: the true weapon of America was not the gun, nor the tank, nor even the bomb, it was the power to build more of all three, faster than anyone else could ever hope to destroy them. June 16, 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas. The air shimmered with heat as the first buses rolled through the gates. Dust swirled under the wheels and settled on the rows of new barracks that stretched into the horizon. The prisoners looked out the windows, eyes adjusting to the pale sunlight of the American South. Beyond the barbed wire stood the flat plains of central Texas, endless and golden, broken only by the silhouettes of windmills and water towers. When the Germans stepped out, the air smelled of grass and grain, so different from the acrid smoke of the front lines. They stood in silence as U.S. Army guards shouted orders in English, then in broken German. The men were marched to registration tables, fingerprinted, deloused, and handed clean uniforms marked PW. Even that small detail caught their attention. The clothes were new, neatly folded, and fit well. The American officer in charge, Major John H. McCarty, watched them closely. He had been warned about fanatical Nazis and expected defiance. Instead, what he saw were weary men, disciplined, yes, but curious. When one prisoner saluted, McCarty returned it. From that moment on, the camp began to settle into a strange rhythm of coexistence. Within days, the German prisoners realized that Camp Hearn was not a prison in the way they'd imagined. It was a small city, surrounded by wire, but buzzing with activity. There were kitchens, workshops, gardens, and even a camp theater. The Geneva Convention rules were posted in multiple languages, and every prisoner was entitled to the same number of calories as American troops. The ration stunned them. White bread, potatoes, meat, vegetables, coffee, butter, served 3 times a day. Some of the prisoners, still gaunt from Africa, ate until they were sick. Others stared at their plates in disbelief. One young corporal from Bremen murmured, "Our civilians are starving. And here, even our enemies are fed like kings." Every morning at dawn, the camp bugle sounded. The Germans lined up for roll call under the wide Texas sky, the air already heavy with heat. After inspection, the men were divided into work detachments. Some were sent to nearby farms to harvest cotton or pick peaches. Others helped mend fences, clear brush, or repair roads. To their surprise, the local farmers often treated them with a mix of caution and respect. The war felt far away here. Texas had lost few sons compared to Europe's devastation, and most civilians simply wanted the labor shortage filled. Under guard, the Germans worked long hours in the sun, sweating through the same fields that fed American soldiers overseas. What shocked them most wasn't the work, it was the freedom. Many times, the guards watched from a distance or even left the prisoners unescorted, trusting them to return. And they did. There was nowhere to run, and no reason to. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, and besides, the food was good. At the end of the day, the prisoners rode back to camp on open trucks, singing old songs from home. As the convoy rolled through small towns, locals would wave from porches. Some threw fruit to them. Occasionally, a woman would turn away, uncomfortable, but rarely did anyone shout insults. A private named Otto Worth once said later, "We had bombed their allies. We had marched across Europe. And yet, the Americans smiled at us." It made no sense. Inside the camp, the Germans rebuilt fragments of their old world. Using scrap lumber, they constructed furniture, carved toys, even built model ships from bread dough. They formed orchestras with violins made from crates and held plays on makeshift stages. At Camp Hearn, one of the largest productions was Faust, performed in German to a full audience of prisoners and guards alike. The U.S. officers encouraged it. They saw it as proof of discipline and morale. But something deeper was happening. Behind the wire, the Germans began to talk, to debate. Some argued about the war's direction. Others whispered doubts about Hitler's promises. At first, the camp's Nazi loyalists, identifiable by their armbands and loud speeches, tried to suppress dissent. They formed secret committees, enforced discipline, and even beat prisoners who spoke against the Reich. But over time, the isolation of America and the quiet rhythm of camp life started to dissolve their control. September 1943, Camp Algona, Iowa. Far north, in the heart of the Midwest, another camp came alive with routine. The Iowa air was crisp, and the field stretched as far as the eye could see. The Germans there worked in canning factories and on corn farms, earning small wages in camp scrip that they could spend on cigarettes, soap, or even postcards. When the first letters from home arrived, they told of bombings in Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin. Whole neighborhoods reduced to ash. For the first time, the men realized that their families were suffering more than they were. In Camp Algona, the camp chaplain, Father Karl Muller, kept a small notebook. In it, he wrote, "They speak now of survival, not of victory." The American Red Cross distributed news bulletins from Europe. Prisoners gathered around the posted sheets, reading the headlines in silence. Soviets advance at Kursk. Italy surrenders to Allies. The news spread quickly through the barracks. Conversations grew quieter. The swagger that had once defined the Afrika Korps began to fade. One afternoon, a sergeant named Ernst Keller, who had fought under Rommel, stood watching a group of American farmers at work beyond the fence. They operated tractors, combines, and trucks, machines built by companies like Caterpillar and John Deere. The precision, the scale, the organization, it all struck him. He said softly to another prisoner, "If they can build machines like that for crops, imagine what they build for war." Meanwhile, the Americans began to notice something unusual. Discipline within the camps was so strong that armed guards were rarely needed. Prisoners policed themselves, held classes, and ran their own councils. They built libraries stocked with German books, some printed by the U.S. Army itself to prevent the circulation of Nazi propaganda. One of the most popular books was Moby Dick, translated into German. The irony wasn't lost on them, a story about obsession and downfall, an allegory of pursuit and blindness that mirrored their own nation's fate. By late 1943, there were more than 400,000 Axis POWs across the United States. Camps stretched from California to Maine, each designed like a small town. Some had movie theaters, sports fields, even orchestras that performed classical music for visiting American officers. At Camp McCain, Mississippi, American soldiers built a baseball field. The Germans, intrigued, began to play their own version of the game. By Christmas, there were tournaments, U.S. Guards versus German teams. Laughter echoed across the fields. War seemed like a distant storm. December 25, 1943, Christmas behind the wire. Snow fell on the wooden roofs of Camp Algona. Inside the mess hall, the Americans had allowed a Christmas tree to be erected. The prisoners decorated it with paper ornaments, tin-foil stars, and bits of cloth dyed with coffee. They sang carols in low voices, "Still Nacht, Heilige Nacht." For a brief moment, the war seemed suspended. One guard, moved by the sound, quietly placed a box of oranges at the edge of the hall. The next morning, the prisoners found it, no note, no orders, just a silent gift. That winter changed many hearts. The propaganda that had painted Americans as barbaric and greedy began to collapse under the weight of small kindnesses. Some prisoners started to question not only their defeat but the moral foundation of the Reich itself. February 1944, Camp Swift, Texas. As the war shifted overseas, so did the POW labor force. Thousands of German prisoners were transferred to agricultural and industrial work details. They helped build irrigation systems, repaired roads, even harvested timber in the forests of Arkansas. The U.S. War Department discovered that POW labor was quietly sustaining the wartime economy. But the camps were changing too. American intelligence officers, working under the office of the Provost Marshal General, began introducing re-education programs. They screened films about democracy, literature, and life in peacetime America. The goal was simple: expose the prisoners to a world without dictatorship. Not all accepted it. Some turned away, calling it propaganda. Others stayed to watch in silence. The most striking moment came after a showing of Why We Fight, a documentary series by Frank Capra. When the lights came up, a German officer muttered, "If even half of that is true, then we were blind." By mid-1944, the mood inside the camps had shifted entirely. The fanaticism had cooled. The men spoke less of victory and more of survival, of home, of what life might be like after all this ended. Letters arrived now with new names: Königsberg, Dresden, Munich, places bombed to rubble. The prisoners began teaching each other skills: carpentry, drafting, mechanics, languages. Camp Hearn's library held thousands of volumes. Some studied English. Others learned mathematics or engineering, hoping for a future beyond the wire. August 1944, Camp Hearn. The news reached them through whispers: the Allies had landed in France. Paris was on the brink of liberation. The Reich, once triumphant, was collapsing. The men gathered in silence around the bulletin board, reading the reports with hollow eyes. A prisoner named Karl Deiler, who had once painted swastikas on his unit's trucks, now spent his days sketching American landscapes, fields, barns, rivers, and blue skies. When asked why, he said quietly, "Because I want to remember the color of peace." For many, captivity had become more than survival, it had become revelation. January 1945, Camp McCain, Mississippi. The cold came late that year, rolling down from the north with sheets of rain that turned the camp roads into rivers of red mud. The Germans huddled in their barracks, reading weeks-old newspapers and listening for rumors of the front. Each new headline sounded worse than the last: Soviets enter East Prussia. Allies cross the Rhine. For months they had watched the steady collapse of the Reich from afar. At first, disbelief. Then denial. Now, silence. The war that had carried them across continents was ending without glory. Inside Camp McCain, the guards had grown relaxed, discipline was more routine than necessity. The prisoners no longer plotted escape or victory. They built furniture, played chess, wrote letters, learned English. The classrooms were full every morning: geometry in one corner, American civics in another. The Americans called it re-education. The prisoners called it understanding. March 1945, Camp Algona, Iowa. A Red Cross radio bulletin broke the stillness of the mess hall: the Ruhr pocket encircled. Berlin under siege. No one cheered, no one cursed. Men simply stared at their coffee cups. That night, a prisoner named Hans Lutke wrote in his notebook, "We are safe, yet our country burns. I do not know whether to be grateful or ashamed." A few days later, a Lutheran chaplain addressed the camp. His sermon was brief: "When you return home, remember that mercy, too, is a kind of strength." Many of the men wept openly for the first time since capture. May 8, 1945, VE Day. The loudspeakers crackled before dawn. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. The words echoed across every camp in America. Some fell to their knees, others simply stood motionless. The guards watched, unsure whether to offer condolences or congratulations. In Camp Hearn, the prisoners asked to lower their improvised German flag, plain cloth stitched from old uniforms. The Americans allowed it. The men folded it carefully, as if burying something sacred and broken. That evening, an American band played outside the fence. The prisoners gathered quietly. When the first notes of Silent Night drifted through the Texas dusk, no one could tell which side the music belonged to anymore. Summer 1945, between fences and freedom. Peace did not mean release. The United States now held over 370,000 German POWs, and Europe lay in ruins. Repatriation could wait, labor was still needed. So, through the long, hot summer, the men worked, harvesting cotton, repairing rail lines, rebuilding the very heart of the country that had defeated them. They earned pennies a day, but many sent those earnings through the Red Cross to families in the rubble of Bremen, Leipzig, and Munich. Some volunteered to teach German to American soldiers preparing for occupation duty. Others painted murals on mess hall walls, scenes of rivers, forests, and cities that no longer existed. At Camp Swift, one painting showed a ruined cathedral beneath a sky clearing after rain. The artist, Karl Deiler, signed it simply, "For After." October 1945, departure orders. Trains began rolling east again, carrying thousands toward ports in New York, Boston, and Norfolk. The same Liberty ships that had brought them across the ocean now waited to take them home. At the docks, the Americans handed out final rations, coffee, cigarettes, chocolate bars. Some guards shook hands. One sergeant, barely 20, told a departing lieutenant, "Good luck rebuilding your country. Don't make us come back." The Germans smiled faintly. "Nor you to ours." As the ships pulled away, the skyline receded into mist. A few prisoners stood at the rails, remembering that first arrival 2 years earlier, the cranes, the endless motion, the sense of awe. Now they understood what they had seen then, not arrogance, but possibility. February 1946, Bremerhaven, Germany. Snow dusted the ruins. The men disembarked into silence, no marching bands, no banners, only the wind moving through the wreckage. Their uniforms were worn, their boots American-made. They walked through cities that no longer resembled the world they had fought for. Children scavenged among bricks, old women queued for bread. Yet everywhere they looked, people were already rebuilding, hammering, digging, patching. Many of the former prisoners slipped quietly into that rhythm. They spoke of America not as an enemy, but as an idea, efficiency without cruelty, order without tyranny, power with mercy. Some would later help found new industries, others would become teachers, engineers, carpenters. A few, scarred but inspired, would dedicate their lives to peace. When interviewers from the Allied Control Council asked what they had learned in captivity, one answered simply, "We learned that freedom is a kind of discipline. It works because people believe in it." April 1946, Hanover, Germany. Rain fell in slow, gray sheets over the city. The air smelled of coal dust and wet stone. Hans Lutke stepped off the transport truck, clutching a canvas satchel that held all he owned, a change of clothes, a letter of discharge, and a photograph of his wife he had carried through Africa, the Atlantic, and America. Where his neighborhood once stood, only fragments of walls remained. A church bell hung crooked, half melted by fire. The street where he'd played as a boy had become a trail of rubble. Yet as he walked, he heard the rhythm of hammers in the distance. Rebuilding had already begun. A child ran past him barefoot, chasing a paper boat through a puddle. It bore an American chocolate wrapper as a sail. He stopped, watching, half smiling. In that moment, he realized, the future was already learning to float. June 1946, Cologne. Karl Deiler stood in what had once been a machine shop, its roof torn away, its tools scattered under glassless windows. He picked up a bent wrench and turned it over in his hands, the motion instinctive. The Americans had left behind toolkits and manuals. He used them to start a small workshop with 2 other returnees, repairing bicycles, then engines, then farm machinery. He painted again in the evenings, often the same image, wide skies, quiet towns, power lines stretching to the horizon. Once, a neighbor asked him why he always painted light instead of ruins. He answered, "Because I've seen what light can build." By the end of the year, he had hung a hand-painted sign above his door, Reparieren ist Hoffnung. Repair is hope. September 1947, Bremen. In a crowded classroom, Erich Keller, the former Wehrmacht captain who had once spoken proudly of Rommel, now stood before a group of teenagers. The blackboard behind him was clean, the desks were salvaged from army stock. He taught mathematics, but sometimes paused mid-lesson to speak of something else. Order, he would say, is not obedience. It is understanding. His students, born in war, listened carefully. When one boy asked him how he knew English so well, Keller smiled faintly. "I learned it behind a fence," he said. "From men who had no reason to teach me." 1949, Bonn, West Germany. A new nation was taking shape. Factories roared again, this time for peace. The Marshall Plan poured steel and capital into the ruins, and the rhythm of production returned, not for conquest, but for rebuilding. Among the engineers and craftsmen now leading the charge were many former POWs, men who had seen America's workshops, its organization, its belief in systems over slogans. They brought that mindset home. Efficiency became a virtue. Planning became second nature. One historian would later write, "They returned with the memory of an order that built without cruelty, and they tried, imperfectly, to recreate it." 1952, Chicago, Illinois. Across the ocean, an American farmer named William Hayes opened a letter from Germany. Inside was a small watercolor of a Texas sunset, painted years earlier on the wall of Camp Hearn. On the back was written, in careful script, "To the man who shared his lunch with me. I did not forget. Carl Deiler." Hayes framed it above his kitchen table. For the rest of his life, he told visitors, "A man who once called me his enemy painted that." 1960, Hanover. Hans Lutke walked the new streets with his grandson, pointing out where buildings had once stood, where bombs had fallen. The city was alive again, trams gliding past, lights glowing in every window. When the boy asked him if he hated the Americans, Lutke shook his head. "No," he said softly. "They showed me what strength looks like when it's not afraid." He paused, looking at the skyline, cranes, smokestacks, the hum of life. "We thought we were the builders," he said. "We were only learning." The echo of abundance across continents, in archives and memories, fragments of that strange brotherhood still remain, a chessboard carved from scrap wood, a faded photograph of smiling guards and prisoners, a diary page stained with coffee from a Liberty ship mess hall. Historians often say that wars are remembered by those who win them. But the story of these men, the ones who lost, tells something rarer. They crossed an ocean in chains and discovered a nation not driven by vengeance, but by the conviction that production could be more powerful than destruction. They went home changed, not defeated, but enlightened by what they had witnessed, the quiet strength of order, the hum of industry, the simple dignity of a full meal freely given. And in the years that followed, as Europe rebuilt itself from ashes, the echo of that abundance, the light, the machinery, the calm discipline, became part of what they carried back, and what they built anew. Because sometimes, history's greatest revolutions begin not with victory, but with the realization of what true power really is.